They called it Clara's Folly, a hideous, bulging monstrosity of creek mud, dark river stones, and hundreds of empty glass bottles smeared across the south side of her late husband's picturesque mountain cabin. The entire town of Blackwood Ridge laughed. Mayor Richard Caldwell threatened to condemn the property, and Greg Harrison, the local timber baron, placed bets at the diner on how quickly she'd freeze to death when November hit. But when the deadliest blizzard in a century buried the valley, cutting off the roads and power lines, the laughter abruptly stopped. While her neighbors burned through their expensive winter reserves in days, shivering in their heavy coats, Clara sat in her living room in short sleeves. And she hadn't touched a single log. The wind in Blackwood Ridge, Colorado, didn't just blow. It hunted. It sought out the cracks in the caulking, the loose shingles, the gaps beneath heavy oak doors, and it drove the icy teeth of winter straight into your bones. For the 40 years Clara Higgins had lived in the valley, the wind had been an adversary kept at bay by two things: her husband Arthur, and a mountain of chopped hickory and oak. Now, Arthur was buried in the town cemetery beneath a frost-hardened patch of earth, claimed by a sudden, massive stroke in the spring. And the woodshed, normally stacked to the roof by late September, was chillingly empty. Clara stood on her back porch, pulling her wool cardigan tighter across her chest. She was 62 years old, her hands weathered from decades of gardening, her spine slightly curved but her spirit unyieldingly stubborn. The air already carried the sharp, metallic scent of impending snow, even though the calendar had barely flipped to October. The reality of her situation was settling over her like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Without Arthur's pension, which had been drastically reduced due to a bureaucratic nightmare after his passing, she was living on a razor-thin margin. The small life insurance policy had barely covered the funeral and the outstanding medical bills. She looked at the empty woodshed, her breath pluming in the crisp air. It took 6 cords of wood to keep the drafty, 1920s-era cabin livable through a Blackwood Ridge winter. Arthur had always felled, split, and stacked the timber himself from the surrounding national forest, a grueling labor of love. Clara simply didn't have the physical strength to fell towering pines, nor the equipment to haul them, which left her at the mercy of Greg Harrison. Greg "Grizzly" Harrison ran the only commercial firewood operation within a 50-mile radius. He was a mountain of a man with a beard that looked like wire wool and a business philosophy entirely devoid of empathy. He knew the winters here were a matter of life and death, and he priced his product accordingly. Later that afternoon, Clara drove her rusting Ford pickup into the gravel lot of Harrison Timber and Supply. The deafening screech of a mechanical log splitter echoed through the yard. Greg was leaning against his massive flatbed, counting a thick wad of cash while a younger employee loaded a delivery. "Clara," Greg said, not looking up from his money. "Sorry about Artie. Again. What can I do for you? Need to get on the delivery schedule?" "I do, Greg," Clara said, keeping her voice steady despite the flutter of anxiety in her stomach. "I need my usual 6 cords. Mix of oak and pine, if you have it." Greg finally looked up, tucking the cash into his grease-stained Carhartt jacket. He pulled a battered clipboard from the bed of his truck. 6 cords. Right. Well, prices have gone up, Clara. Diesel ain't cheap, and the Forest Service raised the permitting fees. I'm getting $4.50 a cord for the mixed hardwood. Clara felt the blood drain from her face. $450? Greg. Last year it was $200. Last year Artie was alive to cut half of it himself, and inflation hadn't kicked us all in the teeth, Greg replied, his tone devoid of sympathy. That's $2,700, plus $100 for delivery. Let's call it an even $2,800. Cash or check? Greg, I don't have that, Clara admitted, her voice dropping to a near whisper. It was a humiliating confession. In Blackwood Ridge, self-reliance was a religion. Admitting poverty was a sin. Could we work out a payment plan? I can give you $500 now. And I ain't a bank, Clara, Greg interrupted, shaking his head. I got guys to pay, equipment to maintain. If I give you credit, I gotta give everyone credit. I can drop off 1 cord for the $500. That'll get you through November if you wear a thick sweater. After that, You better find a way to pay for the rest." He turned his back on her, shouting an order at his employee. The dismissal was absolute. Clara drove back up the winding mountain road, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were stark white. One chord. It was a death sentence. The cabin was notoriously difficult to heat. Its old log walls bled warmth into the frozen night. If she couldn't keep the cast-iron stove roaring, the pipes would burst by December. By January, she would freeze. That evening, wrapped in a quilt in her freezing living room, Clara stared at the lifeless black iron of the wood stove. She looked at the expansive, south-facing wall of her cabin. Arthur had always loved that wall. It caught the sun from dawn until dusk, bathing the living room in golden light. Even if the single-pane windows let the cold seep right through, an old memory surfaced. Before she had moved to the mountains to marry Arthur, Clara had been a high school physics and earth science teacher. She remembered a specific lesson she used to teach her seniors about passive solar heating, thermal mass, and the pioneering architecture of the 1970s energy crisis. She thought of tromba walls, thick, dark structures built to absorb the sun's radiant energy during the day and slowly release it into the living space at night. She looked down at her checkbook. Her balance was a meager $842. She couldn't afford wood, she couldn't afford a modern solar panel array, and she couldn't afford to move. But she had time, she had desperation, and she had a brain. If she couldn't buy heat, she was going to have to trap it, and she was going to use whatever the town threw away to do it. The transformation of Clara Higgins from a grieving, respectable widow into the town eccentric began at the Blackwood Ridge Municipal Dump. 2 days after her encounter with Greg Harrison, Clara backed her Ford pickup up to the massive glass recycling bins. Armed with heavy leather gloves and a pair of safety goggles, she spent 6 hours digging through the refuse, carefully extracting intact glass bottles. Wine bottles, beer bottles, liquor bottles she favored, the dark greens, heavy browns, and deep blues. Liam, the 20-something attendant who ran the weigh station, wandered over, looking bewildered. "Mrs. Higgins? You lose something in there?" "Just doing some collecting, Liam," Clara said cheerfully, hefting a crate of assorted wine bottles into the bed of her truck. "Need these for a home improvement project." Liam scratched his head, watching her load crate after crate of other people's garbage. Okay. You know those are empty, right?" By the end of the week, Clara's yard looked like a makeshift recycling plant. She had accumulated nearly 1,000 glass bottles. But she needed more than just glass to build a thermal mass wall. She needed density. She needed earth and stone. She drove down to the dried-out riverbed at the base of the valley and spent days hauling heavy, dark river rocks. She negotiated with a local farmer to let her dig heavy, iron-rich clay from his property in exchange for mending his fences. She mixed the clay with sand and straw she bought for pennies, stomping it with her boots in a massive tarp to create cob, an ancient, incredibly dense building material. Naturally, in a town of 800 people, secrets were non-existent. Betty Sinclair, whose immaculately manicured property sat just down the hill from Clara's cabin, was the first to sound the alarm. Betty was the self-appointed guardian of Blackwood Ridge's property values and moral fiber. She watched through her high-powered bird-watching binoculars as Clara, covered in mud and sweat, began laying a foundation of dark stone directly against the beautiful, historic logs of the south-facing cabin wall. Betty immediately called Mayor Richard Caldwell. "Richard, it's a tragedy," Betty hissed into the phone, sipping her herbal tea. "The grief has completely snapped her mind. Arthur dies, and now she's out there building a shrine out of garbage. Literal garbage, Richard. Empty whiskey bottles and mud. It looks like a shanty town is sprouting out of her living room." Mayor Caldwell, a man who treated his small-town authority with the gravity of a medieval king, decided an intervention was necessary. He drove up to Clara's cabin in his spotless silver SUV, wearing a tailored suit that looked absurd against the rugged mountain backdrop. Clara was knee-deep in a bucket of wet cob, carefully mortaring a row of green wine bottles between 2 layers of dark river rock. The bottles were laid horizontally, the necks pointing slightly outward, the thick bases pointing inward toward the cabin wall. "Clara!" Richard called out, stepping gingerly to avoid the mud. "What in heaven's name is going on here?" Clara wiped her brow with the back of a muddy forearm, leaving a streak of brown across her pale forehead. "Morning, Richard. I'm retrofitting the cabin." Richard stared at the bizarre structure. It was about 4 feet high so far. A thick, bulging wall of dark earth, studded with the circular glass bottoms of bottles. It covered the lower half of her beautiful picture windows. "Clara, this is an eyesore. Well, it's a pile of trash. You can't just slap mud and garbage onto a historic property." "It's my property, Richard. Paid off in full 10 years ago," Clara replied, her tone polite but firm. "There are zoning ordinances," Richard warned, puffing out his chest. "Rules about exterior modifications. We have to maintain the rustic charm of the ridge. This looks like a squatter's camp. People are talking. Clara, they're worried about your mental state." Clara stopped mortaring. She looked the mayor dead in the eye. "Richard, Greg Harrison wants $3,000 to keep me from freezing to death this winter. The bank won't give me a loan, and my husband's pension is gone. Unless the town council is planning to subsidize my heating bill to maintain the rustic charm of my frozen corpse, I suggest you get off my property and let me build my wall." Richard bristled, his face flushing red. "I'm trying to help you, Clara. If you don't take this monstrosity down, I'll be forced to issue fines. Daily fines." "Issue them," Clara challenged, turning back to her mud. "I'll use the paper to help light my stove. Have a good day, Richard." The mayor stormed off, peeling out of her driveway in a spray of gravel. True to his word, the first citation arrived in the mail 3 days later. Clara didn't even open it. She tossed it into the small kindling box next to her wood stove. The physical toll of the construction was immense. Every night, Clara collapsed into bed, her muscles screaming, her hands blistered and raw despite the gloves. The autumn nights were growing progressively colder, the temperature dipping below freezing. The chill in the cabin was a constant, creeping reminder of her ticking clock. If she didn't finish the wall before the deep freezes set in, the cob wouldn't cure properly, and the structure would crumble. She pushed herself to the absolute limit. She built the wall 2 feet thick, leaving a narrow, 2-inch air gap between her original log exterior and the new mass wall. The dark stones and earth were designed to absorb the solar radiation. The bottles, left unsealed on the outside but capped on the inside, acted as tiny, insulated windows that allowed the sunlight to penetrate deep into the core of the mud wall, trapping the heat like a greenhouse. It was a feat of desperate, back-breaking engineering, but to the outside world, it just looked like madness. By late October, the town of Blackwood Ridge had effectively written Clara Higgins off as a tragic, crazy old woman. The wall was finished. It spanned the entire 25-foot length of her south-facing exterior, reaching all the way to the roofline, swallowing her windows entirely. From the outside, it was objectively hideous. It looked like a giant, warty, dark brown scab affixed to the side of the house, glittering erratically where the bottoms of the glass bottles caught the light. Betty Sinclair had taken to hosting pity coffees on her porch, inviting neighbors over to openly point and stare at the cabin. "It's just so sad," Betty told the local postman one morning, shaking her head as she looked up the hill. "She's entombed herself in garbage. I tried to bring her a casserole, but she just mumbled something about thermal mass and shut the door. We're going to find her frozen solid in there come January, mark my words." Greg Harrison was far less sympathetic. He drove his massive logging truck past Clara's house, deliberately slowly, one afternoon, loaded high with premium, seasoned oak. He laid on the air horn until Clara stepped out onto the porch. "Hey, Clara!" Greg yelled out the window, a cruel smirk splitting his bearded face. "Got a cold front coming in this weekend. Gonna dip down to 10 degrees. You gonna light all that glass on fire? Or are you finally ready to buy some real wood?" Clara looked at his truck, then at her own yard. Beneath a tarp, she had exactly half a cord of scrap wood offcuts, broken pallets she'd scavenged, and fallen branches. It was a pathetic pile that wouldn't last a normal household a week, in a true freeze. "I'm fine, Greg," Clara called back, her voice carrying over the rumble of his diesel engine. "Save it for someone who can afford it." Greg laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Suit yourself, crazy lady. Don't come crying to me when your pipes burst." He hit the gas, leaving a cloud of black exhaust in his wake. Inside the cabin, the atmosphere was vastly different. Because she had covered the south windows with the thick Trombe wall, the living room was noticeably darker during the day. However, Clara had drilled precise holes through her original log wall, aligning them with the capped ends of the glass bottles embedded in her new mud structure. The result was unexpectedly beautiful. As the sun hit the southern face of the house, light traveled through the bottles. The interior wall of her cabin glowed with a mosaic of soft emerald greens, deep ambers, and sapphire blues. It looked like a rustic cathedral, but beauty wasn't going to keep her alive. Performance was. The real test came on November 3rd. The local meteorologists on the radio sounded panicked. A massive, slow-moving Arctic front was colliding with moisture from the Pacific. They were predicting an event they were already calling the whiteout of 26, a blizzard expected to dump 3 feet of snow and plunge temperatures to 20 below zero, with wind chills, making it feel like -40. The town went into a frenzy. The grocery store was stripped bare of bread, milk, and canned goods in hours. Greg Harrison made a killing, charging emergency delivery fees for last-minute cords of wood, his trucks running late into the night. Up on the hill, Clara prepared quietly. She brought her half-cord of scrap wood onto the covered porch. She filled her bathtub with water in case the well pump froze. And then she waited. The storm hit just after dusk. It didn't start with a gentle flurry. It arrived like a freight train. The wind slammed into the cabin with enough force to rattle the floorboards. The temperature plummeted from a brisk 30 degrees down to 0 in less than 2 hours. Clara sat in her armchair in the living room, wearing her thickest wool sweater, a hat, and gloves. She had lit a very small fire in the wood stove, just 3 pieces of pallet wood, more for psychological comfort than anything else. By midnight, the wind was howling like a wounded animal. The radio crackled and died as the power lines further down the mountain snapped under the weight of the ice. The cabin was plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the faint orange glow of the dying fire. Clara walked over to her interior wall, the one facing south. During the day, the sun had been weak, obscured by the gathering storm clouds, but the wall had been absorbing whatever ambient radiation it could. She took off her glove and placed her bare hand flat against the original log wall, right where it backed up against her massive, bizarre creation. She caught her breath. It wasn't just not freezing. It was warm. The 2-foot-thick layer of dense earth and stone outside had been quietly soaking up the sun's heat for weeks, acting like a giant, slow-release thermal battery. Now, as the ambient temperature in the cabin tried to drop, the wall was radiating that stored heat inward, pushing a gentle, steady wave of warmth into the room. Clara moved her hand to one of the glass bottle ends sticking through the log. It was almost hot to the touch. The dark mass was doing exactly what she had calculated it would do. Outside, the blizzard raged, burying Blackwood Ridge under an impenetrable blanket of ice and snow. Down in the valley, her neighbors were aggressively stoking their fires, watching their expensive wood piles shrink in real time as the merciless cold stripped the heat from their homes. Clara smiled in the dark, took off her wool hat, and sat back down. The real test had just begun. But for the first time since Arthur died, she didn't feel afraid of the winter. The whiteout of 26 did not break at dawn. Instead, the storm intensified, dropping another 18 inches of snow by noon, effectively severing Blackwood Ridge from the rest of the world. State Highway 9 was buried under impassable drifts, and the county plows had been ordered off the roads due to zero visibility conditions. Down in the valley, the situation was rapidly deteriorating, from uncomfortable to deadly. Without electricity, the town's modern conveniences became useless liabilities. Electric baseboard heaters were dead. The blowers on gas furnaces refused to ignite. The only sources of heat were wood stoves and fireplaces. And a terrifying realization began to sweep through the community. Nobody had enough wood for a sustained, sub-zero siege. They had all bought into the modern illusion that infrastructure would never truly fail them. Mayor Richard Caldwell paced the hardwood floors of his sprawling, 4,000-square-foot custom home. His breath plumed in the air. The vaulted ceilings and massive, poorly insulated decorative windows, the very features that had made the house a status symbol, were now bleeding heat at an astonishing rate. His thermostat read a chilling 38 degrees and was dropping by the hour. He had burned through his decorative stack of birch logs by 3 a.m. and was now systematically dismantling his expensive mahogany dining chairs with a claw hammer to feed the fireplace. Across town, Greg Grizzly Harrison was discovering the limits of his own greed. When the power grid failed, so did the electronic pumps at the town's only diesel station. The massive hydraulic splitters in his yard sat silent and useless. Worse, his primary stash of seasoned, ready-to-burn oak was buried under a 10-foot snowdrift that had curled over the roof of his warehouse. He had wood, thousands of dollars worth of it, but it was frozen solid, wet, and inaccessible. For the first time in his life, the timber baron was shivering in his own kitchen, wrapped in a sleeping bag, listening to the agonizing sound of his plumbing pipes groaning as the water inside them began to turn to ice. But the real drama was unfolding at the Sinclair residence. Betty Sinclair, the town's most vocal critic of Clara's mud hut, was in serious trouble. Her historic Victorian home was a sieve. The wind tore through the ornate gingerbread trim, finding every uncaulked seam. By the second night of the blizzard, the temperature inside Betty's bedroom was 12 degrees. Her phone was dead. Her woodpile, which she usually paid a neighborhood boy to restock daily, was empty. At 2 a.m., a sound like a shotgun blast echoed through her house. The main water line in her basement had burst, instantly flooding the lower level with freezing water that began to slush and harden almost immediately. Betty huddled under 3 down comforters, her teeth chattering so violently she thought her jaw would fracture. She knew that if she stayed in the house, she would not survive the night. Hypothermia was already clouding her thoughts, making her limbs feel heavy and disconnected. She needed shelter. She needed a fire. The closest house was Clara Higgins' cabin, sitting just 300 yards up the steep, wooded incline. Betty's mind rebelled at the thought. Going to the crazy widow, the woman she had mercilessly mocked to anyone who would listen, was the ultimate humiliation. She pictured Clara frozen solid amidst her garbage wall. But the survival instinct is a brutal, overriding force. Wrapping herself in a full-length mink coat, 2 scarves, and rubber galoshes, Betty forced her front door open against a massive snowdrift. The wind hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. The trek up the hill, normally a 5-minute stroll in the summer, became a 40-minute fight for her life. She crawled on her hands and knees through waist-deep snow, guided only by the faint, shadowy outline of the cabin against the whiteout conditions. When she finally collapsed onto Clara's covered porch, she was crying frozen tears. She pounded on the heavy oak door with fists that felt like blocks of wood. "Clara!" she screamed, her voice instantly swallowed by the howling wind. "Clara! Please! It's Betty! Help me!" There was no answer. Betty's heart sank into her stomach. "She's dead," Betty thought, panic fully taking over. "The old fool froze to death, and now I'm going to die on her porch." She reached for the heavy iron doorknob, expecting it to be locked. To her shock, it turned. Betty pushed the door open and fell into the entryway, bringing a cascade of snow with her. She lay on the floor for a moment, waiting for the biting cold of the unheated cabin to hit her. She waited for the smell of frost and decay. Instead, she smelled cinnamon and old paper. And then, a sensation so foreign and shocking washed over her that she gasped aloud. It was warmth. Deep, pervasive, radiant warmth. "Betty?" A calm voice called out. "Good Lord, woman! Shut the door before you let the cold in." Betty kicked the door shut with her heavy boots, plunging the entryway into darkness, save for a breathtaking, ethereal glow spilling from the living room. She crawled forward, her frozen joints screaming in protest, and peered around the corner. What she saw shattered every preconceived notion she had ever held about Clara Higgins. The living room was illuminated by a soft, kaleidoscopic light. The entire south wall, the interior side of the hideous mud monstrosity, was glowing. The glass bottoms of the hundreds of bottles embedded in the wall were catching the faint, ambient moonlight and the reflection of the snow outside, casting beautiful beams of emerald, amber, and cobalt across the rustic wooden floor. It looked like the inside of a jewel box, but it was the temperature that completely defied logic. It had to be at least 65 degrees in the room. Clara was sitting in her favorite rocking chair, wearing a pair of comfortable slacks and a lightweight, long-sleeved cotton shirt. A single, battery-powered reading lamp illuminated a thick paperback novel in her lap. The iron wood stove in the corner was dark and cold. There wasn't a single ember burning within it. "Clara," Betty stammered, her teeth still chattering as she struggled to her feet. My pipes burst. I thought you'd be frozen?" Clara offered a small, knowing smile. She set her book down and stood up, moving with a surprising agility for a woman her age. "I imagined most of the town thought that. Take off that wet coat, Betty. You're bringing the frost in. I'll get you a blanket and some tea. I have a kettle keeping warm on a camp stove in the kitchen." Betty numbly obeyed, peeling off the heavy, snow-caked mink. She stepped closer to the glowing wall, her hands hovering inches from the dark, plastered surface between the glass bottle ends. Heat was rolling off it in slow, steady waves, like a massive stone baking in the summer sun. "How?" Betty whispered, staring at the wall in awe. "You don't have a fire going. Greg Harrison said you only bought scrap wood. The power is out." Clara handed Betty a steaming mug of peppermint tea and draped a heavy quilt over her shoulders. "It's called thermal mass, Betty. Physics. The sun hit that wall all through October. The dark stone and the dense clay absorbed the heat. The bottles let the solar radiation penetrate deep into the core. Now that the ambient temperature has dropped, the wall is slowly releasing all that stored energy back into the house." "But it's just mud and garbage," Betty said, the insult slipping out before she could catch herself. Clara didn't take offense. She just laughed softly. "Nature doesn't care about aesthetics, Betty. It cares about density and insulation. My garbage wall is holding about 40 tons of thermal weight. It's a battery, and right now, it's discharging." Betty sat on the sofa, clutching the warm mug, her worldview completely upended. The woman she had mocked, the woman the entire town had pitied, had outsmarted them all. She wasn't just surviving, she was comfortable. 2 hours later, another desperate pounding at the door startled them both. Clara opened it to find Mayor Richard Caldwell, looking like a defeated mountaineer. His tailored suit was ruined beneath a frozen, bright orange hunting parka. His face was pale, his lips carrying a dangerous tinge of blue. "Clara," Richard wheezed, leaning against the doorframe. "I came to check on you. As mayor, it's my duty to ensure the vulnerable citizens are." He trailed off, his eyes widening as the wave of warm air hit his face. He looked past Clara and saw Betty Sinclair sitting on the sofa, wrapped in a quilt, looking thoroughly thawed and embarrassed. "Richard?" Betty called out. "Did your pipes burst too?" The mayor stepped inside, pushing the door shut. He stripped off his gloves, his hands shaking violently, and walked directly toward the glowing bottle wall. He placed his palms flat against the warm earth, his eyes closing in pure, desperate relief. The arrogant politician vanished, replaced by a man humbled by the brutal reality of nature. "It's warm," Richard muttered, almost to himself. "My God, it's actually warm. I've burned my dining room table, Clara. I burned my daughter's old crib just to keep the master bedroom above freezing. And you have no fire." "I have the sun, Richard," Clara said simply, walking toward her small kitchen area. "And a lot of empty wine bottles. Would you like some tea? The camp stove is still running." As dawn finally broke on the third day, the storm began to recede, leaving Blackwood Ridge buried under a silent, glittering expanse of white. But inside Clara's cabin, a profound shift had occurred. The mayor of Blackwood Ridge and the town's chief gossip were sitting at a small wooden table, drinking tea, and staring at the wall they had tried to condemn. The mockery was gone. In its place was a desperate, burning curiosity. "Clara," Richard said quietly, his hands wrapped tightly around his mug. "When the road's clear, when the plows finally get through." He hesitated, swallowing hard. "Do you think you could show me how to build one of these?" Clara looked at the glowing glass bottles, then at the mayor. The power dynamic of the entire town had just violently shifted, pivoting entirely on a wall made of creek mud and refuse. "I suppose I could, Richard," Clara smiled, her eyes glinting in the morning light. "But my consultation fees have gone up. Inflation. You know, the plows finally broke through the drifts on State Highway 9 on the 4th afternoon, their massive yellow blades scraping the asphalt like the bells of liberation. The whiteout of 26 had officially ended, but the devastation it left behind in Blackwood Ridge was catastrophic. As the sun emerged, glaring off the blinding white landscape, the true toll became agonizingly clear. Over 40 homes had suffered catastrophic plumbing failures, resulting in flooded basements and cracked foundations. The town's only hardware store, run by a soft-spoken man named Arthur Pendleton, sold out of PVC pipe, joint compound, and space heaters in exactly 11 minutes. The insurance claims alone were expected to reach into the millions, but amidst the chaos, a strange and powerful rumor began to circulate, moving faster than the melting ice. It started with Betty Sinclair. Betty, whose historic Victorian was currently housing 4 inches of solid ice in the root cellar, had abandoned her usual post at the country club. Instead, she stood in the middle of the crowded grocery store aisle, draped in her mink coat, speaking to a captivated audience of shivering housewives. "I am telling you, Martha, I was ready to meet my maker," Betty declared, her voice echoing over the hum of the backup generators. "I crawled up that hill expecting to find a corpse. Instead, Clara Higgins was reading a paperback in 65-degree heat. She didn't have a single log burning. It's all in the mud. The mud in the wine bottles. It's some sort of thermal sorcery." Mayor Richard Caldwell, usually desperate to control the town's narrative, did not deny Betty's wild claims. In fact, he corroborated them. During an emergency town hall meeting held in the freezing high school gymnasium, Richard stood before the exhausted, frostbitten citizens and pointed a trembling finger toward the mountain. "We have relied entirely on the grid and Greg Harrison's timber," the mayor boomed into the battery-powered megaphone. "And when the grid failed and the timber froze, we nearly died. All of us, except Clara Higgins. I saw it with my own eyes. She has built a self-sustaining heating engine out of things we threw away." Almost overnight, the monstrosity of Blackwood Ridge became a site of pilgrimage. Clara's driveway, previously empty save for the occasional delivery truck, was suddenly packed with vehicles. People who had pointed and laughed just 2 weeks prior were now trudging up her front steps, notebooks in hand, offering casseroles, jars of preserves, and cash just to get a glimpse of the glowing glass wall. Clara, possessing the sharp mind of a former educator and the pragmatism of a woman who had nearly starved to death, capitalized on the moment. She didn't hold grudges, but she didn't offer charity to those who had mocked her, either. She set up a small chalkboard on her porch. It read, "Passive solar consultation, $50 or 2 bags of groceries. Group rates available." She taught them about thermal mass. She drew diagrams on scrap paper, explaining the optimal thickness of a cob wall, the specific angle of the winter sun at their latitude, and how to properly seal the interior glass to prevent drafts. She explained the difference between insulation, which stops heat transfer, and thermal mass, which stores and releases it. For the first time since her husband Arthur died, Clara's cabin was filled with life, laughter, and respect. Her pantry was overflowing. Her bank account, previously hovering near zero, began to show a healthy, growing balance. But every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Down in the valley, a storm of a very different kind was brewing. Greg Grizzly Harrison sat in his heavily paneled office at Harrison Timber and Supply, staring furiously at his ledger. The phone, which usually rang off the hook in November with desperate orders for cordwood, was dead silent. Worse, his fax machine was spitting out cancellations. 3 of his biggest commercial clients, including the local bed and breakfast, had canceled their midwinter deliveries, citing alternative heating renovations. Greg crumpled a cancellation notice in his massive, calloused hand. His monopoly on the town's survival was evaporating. He had built his empire on the town's dependency, exploiting their fear of the cold to keep his prices sky-high. Now, a 62-year-old widow with a pile of garbage was threatening to bankrupt him. "She thinks she's untouchable," Greg snarled to his foreman, kicking a wastebasket across the room. "Building unpermitted mud huts and calling it science. We'll see how warm she is when the county gets through with her." Greg Harrison didn't just have money. He had leverage. He supplied the lumber for every county project, and over the years, he had lined the pockets of more than a few local officials to ensure building codes favored his materials. He picked up the phone and dialed a direct number. He asked for Mitchell Boone. Mitchell Boone was the chief building inspector for Oakhaven County. He was a small, petty man who wore ill-fitting suits and wielded his administrative power like a broadsword. He was also heavily indebted to Greg Harrison, having secured a suspiciously cheap supply of premium cedar for his own wraparound deck the previous summer. "Mitch," Greg said, his voice dropping to a dangerous gravel. "I've got a massive code violation up on the ridge. Clara Higgins. She's built a 25-foot unreinforced earth structure right against the load-bearing wall of a historic cabin. It's packed with shattered glass. It's a structural hazard, an eyesore, and I'm pretty sure it violates the county's environmental waste ordinances. I want it gone." 2 days later, just as Clara was finishing a consultation with a young couple wanting to retrofit their farmhouse, a white county vehicle with flashing yellow lights pulled into her driveway. Mitchell Boone stepped out, carrying a heavy metal clipboard and an expression of manufactured bureaucratic outrage. Greg Harrison's heavy-duty pickup truck idled at the bottom of the hill, watching like a vulture. Clara walked out onto the porch, wiping chalk dust from her hands. "Can I help you, Clara Higgins?" Boone asked, barely glancing at her as he marched directly toward the trombe wall. He tapped the hardened mud with a steel pen. "I'm Mitchell Boone, county inspector. I'm here regarding multiple reports of unpermitted, hazardous construction." Clara's heart did a slow, painful roll in her chest. She had outsmarted the weather, but she knew the terrifying power of red tape. "It's a passive solar wall, Mr. Boone. It's built on my own foundation. It saved my life during the blizzard." "The weather is irrelevant to the building code, Mrs. Higgins," Boone replied coldly, snapping several photos with a digital camera. "This is an unengineered modification to a primary dwelling. You have no structural blueprints. You used non-standard, untested materials, namely landfill refuse. Furthermore, the weight of this mud is likely compromising the foundational integrity of the original cabin." "That's absurd," Clara shot back, her teacher's voice cutting through the crisp air. "It's self-supporting. There is a 2-inch gap between the cob and the log wall. It doesn't bear any weight on the house at all. I calculated the load distribution myself." "Are you a licensed structural engineer, Mrs. Higgins?" Boone asked, a smug smile playing on his lips. "I taught physics for 30 years, Clara retorted. "I'll take that as a no," Boone said. He pulled a bright, fluorescent red sticker from his clipboard, peeled off the backing, and slapped it aggressively onto Clara's beautiful oak front door. The bold black letters screamed, "Condemned. Unfit for habitation." Clara stared at the sticker, the blood draining from her face. "You can't do this. I've lived here for 40 years. I am issuing an emergency demolition order," Boone stated, handing her a thick packet of citations. "You have 14 days to hire a licensed, county-approved demolition crew to tear this wall down and dispose of the hazardous materials properly. If you fail to comply, the county will execute the demolition, bill you for the labor, and seize the property if you cannot pay. Until then, you are ordered to vacate the premises." He turned and walked back to his car, leaving Clara standing on her porch, clutching the paperwork. Down at the bottom of the hill, Greg Harrison honked his horn twice, a cheerful, mocking sound before driving away. That evening, Clara sat in her living room. The wall was glowing beautifully, radiating the day's heat, keeping the cabin a perfect 68 degrees. But the warmth couldn't touch the ice forming in her chest. She looked at the paperwork. A county-approved demolition would cost thousands of dollars, money she still didn't have. And even if she tore it down, she would be right back where she started, freezing, helpless, and at the mercy of Greg Harrison's pricing. The county had given her a choice: destroy her salvation or lose her home entirely. She buried her face in her hands, the exhaustion of the past 2 months finally crashing down on her. The silence of the cabin felt heavy and absolute. She had fought the wind, the snow, and the mockery, but she didn't know how to fight the law. Just as the first tear slipped down her cheek, she heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Clara wiped her eyes and walked to the window. Outside, in the freezing dark, stood Mayor Richard Caldwell, Betty Sinclair, and Arthur Pendleton from the hardware store. Behind them, pulling into the yard, were half a dozen other cars belonging to the citizens of Blackwood Ridge. Richard stepped up to the porch and looked at the bright red condemned sticker. He reached out, his face set in a look of grim determination, and ripped it cleanly off the door. He knocked. Clara opened it, staring in bewilderment at the crowd gathering in her yard. "Clara," the mayor said, his voice carrying the weight of the entire valley. "Betty told me about the county inspector. It seems Mr. Harrison thinks he can use our local government to protect his profit margins." "Richard, he gave me 14 days, Clara said, her voice shaking slightly. "He said they'll take the house." "They won't take a damn thing," Arthur Pendleton grumbled from the bottom of the steps. "Not unless they want to go through all of us." Richard nodded, stepping into the warm entryway. "Clara, you taught us how to survive the winter. Tomorrow night is the bi-weekly county council meeting in Oakhaven. I've added a special emergency addendum to the agenda. We aren't going to tear your wall down." The mayor smiled, a sharp, political glint in his eye. "We're going to rewrite the county building code, and we need our physics teacher to lead the lecture." The Oakhaven County Council chambers usually smelled of stale coffee, floor wax, and bureaucratic boredom. But on the evening of November 14th, the air in the cramped, fluorescent-lit room crackled with an electric, dangerous tension. Greg "Grizzly" Harrison sat in the front row, his massive arms crossed over his chest. He was flanked by Mitchell Boone, the county inspector, and a sleek, high-priced zoning attorney from Denver named Bradley Carmichael. Greg looked supremely confident. He had spent the last 48 hours making phone calls, calling in favors, and ensuring that the 5-person council knew exactly who funded their re-election campaigns. At 7 p.m., Chairman William Davies, a man who perpetually looked like he was suffering from indigestion, banged his wooden gavel. Next on the emergency docket, the matter of the condemned structure at 402 Pine Ridge Road, Blackwood Ridge. Property of Clara Higgins. Bradley Carmichael stood up smoothly, buttoning his expensive suit jacket. "Mr. Chairman, members of the council, we are here to finalize the demolition order for an unpermitted, structurally hazardous, and frankly, chemically concerning accumulation of landfill refuse attached to a residential property. Inspector Boone has provided a comprehensive 80-page risk assessment. We ask that the council expedite the demolition to protect the community." "Thank you, Mr. Carmichael," Chairman Davies muttered, shuffling his papers. "Does the property owner, Mrs. Higgins, have a statement before we vote?" The heavy oak doors at the back of the chamber swung open with a resounding crack. Into the room strode Mayor Richard Caldwell, no longer looking like a defeated man in a frozen house. He was wearing his best tailored suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, radiating the fierce authority of a small-town leader who had almost watched his people die. Behind him was Clara Higgins. She wore a simple, dignified wool skirt and blazer, clutching a leather briefcase that used to belong to her husband. And behind Clara was the town of Blackwood Ridge. Betty Sinclair, Arthur Pendleton, Liam from the dump, and over 60 other residents filed into the room, filling the pews, lining the walls, and spilling out into the hallway. The sheer volume of people shifted the temperature in the room. They weren't just an audience, they were an army. And they looked at Greg Harrison with a cold, collective fury. Chairman Davies paled. "Mayor Caldwell, what is the meaning of this disruption?" "This isn't a disruption, Bill," Richard said, marching straight up to the speaker's podium. "This is democracy. You are about to vote on a demolition order that affects the survival of my town. I yield my speaking time to Clara Higgins." Clara stepped up to the microphone, She didn't look at Greg Harrison. She looked directly at the 5 council members. For 30 years, she had stood in front of classrooms full of unruly teenagers. 5 corrupt local politicians were nothing. Members of the council, Clara began, her voice steady and clear, projecting beautifully through the room. Inspector Boone has classified my passive solar trombe wall as a hazardous accumulation of refuse. Let's address the hazard. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of manila folders, passing them to the council. In those folders, you will find a minute-by-minute temperature log of my home during the whiteout of 26, Clara stated. While the ambient temperature in this county dropped to -20 degrees, and the power grid failed for 4 days, my home never dropped below 64 degrees. I burned less than half a cord of scrap wood. I didn't require emergency services. My pipes didn't burst, saving the county's overwhelmed water infrastructure from further strain. She paused, letting the data sink in. My wall is not a hazard. It is a highly efficient, thermal mass battery built on the foundational principles of thermodynamics. Principles, I might add, that are standard in modern green building codes across the globe, though apparently foreign to Oak Haven County. Mitchell Boone jumped out of his seat, his face flushing violently red. It's unengineered. It's a pile of mud leaning against a wooden house. It doesn't matter how warm it is. It's going to collapse and kill someone. Ah, Clara smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression. Structural integrity. I'm so glad you brought that up, Mr. Boone. She reached into her briefcase one last time. When Mr. Boone issued his condemnation 2 days ago, he noted I lacked a licensed structural engineer's approval. Fortunately, teaching physics for 30 years means you send a lot of bright minds out into the world. Clara held up a thick, officially bound document, stamped with a raised metallic seal. This is a certified structural analysis and retroactive permit approval, signed and stamped by David Rosenberg, the lead structural engineer at Vanguard Architectural in Denver. David was a student of mine in 1998. When I called him yesterday and sent him the core samples, photographs, and load calculations of my wall, he drove 4 hours through the snow to inspect it in person last night. The color drained completely from Mitchell Boone's face. Greg Harrison gripped the back of the pew in front of him so hard the wood groaned. Mr. Rosenberg's report, Clara continued, her voice echoing in the stunned silence, certifies that the wall is completely freestanding on its own gravel trench foundation. It places 0 lateral load on the historic cabin. Furthermore, the use of glass bottles and cob is rated to withstand seismic events that would level half the conventionally framed houses in this county. She slammed the report down on the podium. The sound made Chairman Davies flinch. The only hazard here, Clara said, her eyes finally locking onto Greg Harrison, is the danger this wall poses to a certain business model, a model that relies on keeping the citizens of Blackwood Ridge desperate, freezing, and dependent. The room erupted. Betty Sinclair started the applause, clapping so hard her jewelry rattled, and within seconds, the entire town was on their feet, cheering, whistling, and stomping their boots on the hardwood floor. Chairman Davies banged his gavel frantically, but it was useless against the roar of a community that had finally found its warmth. The morning after the Oak Haven County Council meeting, Clara Higgins woke to a silence that felt fundamentally different than the heavy, oppressive quiet of the past 2 months. This silence wasn't the sound of isolation or impending freezing. It was the deep, resonant peace of absolute victory. She lay in bed for a long moment, watching the early dawn light begin to filter through the doorway of her bedroom. The ambient temperature in the cabin was a perfectly comfortable 66 degrees, despite the thermometer outside her frosted window registering a bitter 8 degrees below zero. She threw off her light quilt, slipped her feet into her worn wool slippers, and walked into the living room. The trombe wall stood before her, a massive, dark monument of earth, stone, and glass. As the sun crested the eastern ridge of the mountains, the first direct rays struck the south-facing exterior. Inside, the glass bottle ends embedded in the plaster began to ignite, glowing with deep, jewel-toned brilliance. Emerald greens, sapphire blues, and rich, whiskey-colored ambers painted the rustic wooden floorboards in a vibrant mosaic. Clara walked over and placed her palm flat against the plaster. It was already radiating a steady, comforting warmth, discharging the thermal energy it had hoarded from the previous day. She walked into the kitchen, struck a match to light her small propane camp stove to boil water for tea, and glanced at the trash can. Resting right at the top was the crumpled, bright red, condemned sticker. Clara smiled, a genuine, unguarded expression that crinkled the corners of her eyes. The battle was over. The war for Blackwood Ridge's independence had just begun. Down in the valley, the reality of the council's unanimous reversal was hitting Greg Grizzly Harrison with the force of a falling redwood. Greg arrived at Harrison Timber and Supply at 6 in the morning, unlocking the heavy chain-link gates to a yard that felt eerily desolate. The massive hydraulic splitters, usually screaming with diesel power by dawn, sat silent and dusted with frost. His foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Bill, was waiting by the office door, holding a thick stack of pink paper slips. "Morning, boss," Bill said, his voice lacking its usual gruff energy. He held out the slips. "These came through the fax machine overnight, and the answering machine is full." "It's bad, Greg." Greg snatched the papers, his heavy boots echoing on the frozen gravel. They were cancellations, dozens of them. Residential clients, commercial accounts, even the county parks department had pulled their standing order for the winter season. "What the hell is this?" Greg snarled, his face flushing dark red. "The storm just broke. They still need wood. It's November." "They don't want ours," Bill replied, shifting his weight uncomfortably. "Word got out about what you tried to do to the Higgins woman with Mitchell Boone. The whole town knows you tried to take her house to protect the ledger. Martha down at the grocery store wouldn't even sell me coffee this morning. Said her machines were temporarily down. Greg, we've got 3 guys who didn't show up for their shift today. They quit." Greg stormed into his office, slamming the door so hard the framed photographs of his logging trucks rattled on the faux wood paneling. He spent the next 4 hours making desperate phone calls. He called the local diner, offering to slash his prices to $150 a cord, a staggering loss. The owner politely told him they were installing heavy thermal drapery and a high-efficiency pellet stove, and hung up. He called his contacts in Denver, trying to offload his massive, frozen surplus, only to find that shipping costs would bankrupt him. By noon, the timber baron was sitting at his desk, staring out the window at mountains of unsold oak and pine. His monopoly, built on decades of exploiting the town's fear of the cold, had been entirely dismantled by a retired high school physics teacher and a pile of scavenged garbage. Over the next 6 months, Harrison Timber and Supply would be forced to sell off a massive portion of its acreage and liquidate its heavy machinery just to avoid bankruptcy, reducing Greg from a feared local tycoon to a bitter, marginalized supplier of basic lumber. Meanwhile, the town of Blackwood Ridge was undergoing a profound physical and psychological metamorphosis. The near-death experience of the whiteout of 26 had stripped away their complacency. They no longer trusted the fragile power grid, and they absolutely refused to rely on Greg Harrison. Arthur Pendleton's hardware store became the epicenter of this new revolution. Arthur, realizing the shifting tides, rapidly pivoted his inventory. He cleared out aisles of expensive, decorative electric space heaters and replaced them with pallets of high-yield masonry clay, specialized thermal-rated glass sealant, dark mortar dye, and heavy-duty weather stripping. Betty Sinclair, previously the town's chief gossip and arbiter of high society aesthetics, underwent the most shocking transformation. Having nearly frozen to death in her immaculate Victorian home, Betty became a zealous convert to passive solar energy. She traded her mink coat for a heavy canvas Carhartt jacket and organized what the town began to call retrofit rallies. Every weekend, dozens of neighbors would descend on a single house, pooling their labor to tear out drywall, insulate attics, seal drafts, and, wherever a southern exposure permitted, build mini-thermal mass walls. The Blackwood Ridge Municipal Dump had to completely restructure its operations. Liam, the young attendant, found himself managing a highly organized resource center. Empty glass bottles were no longer crushed. They were carefully sorted by color, thickness, and size, placed on wooden pallets, and treated with the reverence of precious building materials. At the center of it all was Clara Higgins. She had not intended to start a business, but the demand for her knowledge was staggering. Recognizing that she couldn't physically build every wall herself, she officially registered Ridge Solar Consulting. She charged a modest, fair fee for her time, ensuring she was financially secure for the rest of her life without ever exploiting her neighbors. On a crisp Tuesday morning in early spring, Clara stood in the living room of a young couple, Chloe and Ben, who had recently purchased a drafty farmhouse on the outskirts of town. Chloe was pregnant with their first child, and they were terrified of facing the next winter with their outdated propane furnace. Clara stood in front of their large, south-facing windows, holding a clipboard and a laser thermometer. She was in her element, the sharp, authoritative cadence of her teaching days returning in full force. "You have excellent solar gain here," Clara explained, pointing to the sun pooling on the scuffed hardwood. "But right now, all that heat is bouncing back out through the single-pane glass the moment the sun goes down. We don't need to block the window entirely, like I did at my cabin. We are going to build a half-height trombe wall just beneath the sill. We'll use dark, dense river stone from the creek bed, mortared with high clay cob." Ben scribbled furiously in a notebook. "And the bottles? Mrs. Higgins? Do we need to scavenge the dump?" "Call me Clara, Ben," she smiled. "And yes, but only for the decorative top layer to allow light to penetrate the core. We need mass here. Density. You build a 2-foot-thick stone wall right here. Paint the exterior-facing side a matte black, and leave a 1-inch air gap between the stone and the glass. It will absorb the daytime radiation and act like a massive radiator all night long. It won't replace your furnace entirely, but it will cut your heating bill by 70%. Chloe looked at the floor, relief washing over her face. "You really think it will keep the baby warm?" "I know it will, Chloe," Clara said softly, her eyes filled with a gentle certainty. "Physics never lies. You just have to know how to listen to it." By the time September rolled around, exactly 1 year since Arthur had passed, and her woodshed had stood terrifyingly empty, Blackwood Ridge was a changed place. It was no longer a town holding its breath in fear of the cold. It was a community heavily armored against it. The Clara Clause had been officially written into the Oakhaven County Building Code, legally protecting and encouraging sustainable, passive solar modifications. Late one afternoon, Clara walked out onto her back porch. The air carried the sharp, familiar bite of impending autumn. She wore a light sweater and held a mug of steaming herbal tea. She walked over to the old woodshed. It no longer held a single log of oak or pine. Over the summer, with the help of Liam and Arthur Pendleton, Clara had enclosed the shed with salvaged storm windows, transforming it into a passive solar greenhouse. Inside, late-season tomatoes, heavy bell peppers, and vibrant green herbs were thriving in the trapped, humid heat. Clara stepped inside the greenhouse, inhaling the rich, loamy scent of the warm earth. She reached out and gently adjusted a trailing tomato vine. She thought of her husband. Arthur had been a good man, a strong man who believed that survival meant fighting nature, cutting it down, splitting it open, and burning it to stay alive. He had worked himself into the grave trying to provide that heat. Clara had learned a different way. She had learned that you didn't have to fight the mountain, or the wind, or the bitter cold. You just had to outsmart it. You had to catch the sun and hold it close. Clara walked back to the cabin and paused at the front door, looking at the massive, dark mud wall studded with glittering glass. It was beautiful in its utility, a monument to defiance and intellect. She didn't fear the coming winter anymore. Let the blizzards howl and the power lines snap. She was ready. Clara opened the door, stepped into the deep, radiant warmth of her home, and quietly closed the cold out behind her. The story of Clara Higgins stands as a powerful testament to human resilience and the triumph of intellect over adversity. When stripped of her financial security and grieving the loss of her husband, Clara refused to become a victim to the brutal mountain winters or the greed of a local monopoly. By marrying her knowledge of physics with desperate scavenged materials, she transformed her home and, ultimately, the mindset of an entire town. The mockery she endured only sweetened the vindication when her garbage wall proved to be a life-saving feat of thermal engineering. Blackwood Ridge learned a hard but invaluable lesson during the whiteout of 26. True survival isn't about how much you can afford to burn, but how cleverly you can adapt. Clara's legacy is a glowing reminder that sometimes the most profound innovations are built from the things others have carelessly thrown away.